Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, YatogamiOdin has requested some discussion about Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, and its controversy was recently brought to my attention. Yatogami says that this children's poem has garnered controversy in some circles to the point of being banned, and we're going to talk about that today. It's a very short read, linked below. I've linked it for all of you. Now, it's a simple enough poem, I think a somewhat well-known enough poem, and it's a short enough poem that I don't think me reading it would add too much. Go read it real quick. It will take like 2 seconds if you haven't seen it before. But you'll get the gist of it through the discussion if you're not interested in that. This parlay is largely going to be about basically like banning things for children. So if you really aren't interested in following it, that's fine. I didn't feel like me reading it would add enough. So yeah, it's linked below if you want it. With the gist being that the eponymous Giving Tree sacrifices almost everything she has to the other character, who's first seen as a boy and ends the poem as an old man. Critics of the poem point to the boy and the tree's relationship as abusive or otherwise unhealthy. The boy, to whom the tree only ever refers to as boy, despite clearly aging, shows token gratitude but never gives anything back to the tree. The arguments invoke such phrases as selfishness, narcissism, and codependency. Other people draw comparisons to a parent-child relationship, with its beginning stages, which in its beginning stages is somewhat similar in its non-reciprocity. It's simply expected that the parent is a provider and the child is provided for, with little to no reciprocal exchange as far as can be measured materially. The focus here is instead on the tree's unconditional love. Yatogami says the talking points here are general and open-ended. So we'll pause for a minute, we'll look at those spoilered bits later, and yeah, let's talk about it. I'm going to do 3 basic things. First, I'm going to give my reading, what I mean is my interpretation of the poem, so we can think about what is this thing that people seem to think should or shouldn't be read by children. What is it? When people think the poem is about an abusive relationship, is that in the text or is that coming from them? We're going to bridge that discussion into this idea of there's kind of 2 ways you could discuss this. You could really philosophically engage with both of these points, the critics and the people who are for the poem for children. Or I think these are really separate things. You could tackle, but like socially, what's going on here? But why do people feel the need to ban a thing? Because I don't think a lot of the people who ban a book or when a religion, bans a thing, they're not really arguing in good faith most of the time. There's actually some other objection a lot of the time, or there's some other source of the desire to push the thing away. Even though there is a philosophically valid point, that's not actually their point, but they're just kind of using that as a thing to do a thing with. This is quite common in politics too, for example, where I'm sure you can think of times where you feel like there's a bit of doublespeak. Someone is speaking as though they're going to support or they're talking about one issue, but that's meant to be understood to mean that they're talking about something else, or they are trying to make people not notice that they're talking about something else. It could go either way. Again, I think in this case, many people who don't think that this poem is okay for children to read probably don't know why they really don't think it's okay for children to read it. But I feel like it's pretty clear. I feel like it comes from fear, basically, or lack of faith. It's hard to have faith in children, and that is misplaced, in my opinion. So to be blunt, to give a conclusion, I think it's pretty silly to be worried about children reading this book. I feel like that's a lack of even my only very basic understanding of child psychology. Children just don't interpret things in such an incredibly oversimplified way as for this to be a problem. But I think that when people are upset about children reading this text, it's because they don't have that faith, somewhat understandably, that children are going to feel that way. I think if you really ask them, do you think children just 1-for-1 copy every experience they read, even if it's portrayed as negative, they would say no. And if they believe that, then there's no problem with children reading this poem, at least in my opinion. However, they then say, we don't want children to read this poem, and that's basically why. Again, I think they would say it as, oh, it's because of an abusive relationship. I don't really think that's why. So there's going to be kind of two separate things, one of which is discussing maybe socially, you know, and then really philosophically engaging with like, okay, sure, yeah, but you could consider that a concern. I don't think that those people are, but you could. Is that a problem? So let's do that. So a reading of the poem, and what by that I mean an interpretation. Pretty simple. I personally think that this poem is fairly clearly about parenting. Yeah. The poem is titled "The Giving Tree," and it's told from the perspective of the tree. Again, if you're not going to read the poem, or just as a recap, if you've read it and maybe you remember it vaguely, that was me. I read it again for this parlay, but a refresher is that basically the poem consists of a tree and a boy playing with the tree. The boy is going to be seen visiting the tree from time to time, but less and less often throughout their life as they age and get older. The tree only ever refers to the boy as boy. The poem is focused on the perspective of the tree. The poem is titled after a tree, and the poem involves the tree being pretty happy with the boy early on, sad when in the middle of the boy's life they're not with the tree very much, and then happy again when they get to end their lives together. I just feel like that's quite obviously parenthood. It seems pretty, it's not really trying to hide much, this poem, I don't think. Again, when we talk about this poem more philosophically, there is a real question here. I don't think this poem is very subtle, but is it unsubtle enough for a child to not misunderstand? Okay, I think yes, but that's something to discuss. I don't think the people who are banning this poem are really engaging that topic, but we will. That was my point from before. So I think it's about parenthood. I have trouble finding any other reading of this poem that isn't about parenthood. I think it's about parenthood. There's a suggestion that this poem could be seen as just being about relationships, like not specifically a parent-child relationship, which I don't think that's really in the text, but I guess it's a little bit in the text. You could view this poem as being about, I guess, codependency. I get why someone would say that. I just feel like it sort of skips some clues, is putting it mildly, in the text that suggests that but it's about parenting specifically. Now, here's a question to get us started. Does the poem think that parenting is an unhealthy relationship? Does the poem think that? I think a weird thing going on with any controversy with this poem might be that people can't think that parenting is unhealthy, but it kind of is. And so the poem is I'm not sure what the poem has to say about that. I guess the poem, it lays the matter bare. The poem has you could argue, happy ending, but it also ends in death. So I'm not sure. I don't think that the poem has a strong opinion either way about parenting being a good or bad process. That's my opinion. Now, I'm very biased. I think that the traditional family structure has a lot of problems that people hand wave because they consider it to be a given. People don't generally question what's there. So many people around us basically parenting is free of criticism because it just is. It's considered to be the only way for a lot of people. Their family is kind of their final fallback option. That's what they feel like family is for. It's the people that are there no matter what, that you tolerate no matter what, stuff like that. And so family is kind of free of criticism as an ideology, but of course it isn't. And philosophically, absolutely, we are going to attack the concept of a family. Parenting is an unhealthy relationship, in my opinion. And so I'm quite biased when I read this poem. But searching the text, I don't really see anything actually written in the poem that I feel like supports my personal view, which is that parenting is kind of unhealthy. I feel like the poem is neutral on the subject, but I have a bias I'm trying to counteract, which you sort of can't. So I wonder if people feel differently. But I think the poem is pretty neutral. I think one of the strengths of this poem for me is that it isn't very it is depicting a situation. It's a picture, maybe you would say. It's not necessarily slanting that picture, maybe you could say. It's a poem about something that almost everybody would agree with what you are seeing being sad if you were looking at these things happen. The poem says, and the tree is sad when something that almost everyone would agree is sad happens to the tree. It's not like the poem says that someone has an emotion that seems to fly in the face of like a lot of people's emotional instincts. I think. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't like the idea of parenting. Um, anyway, what else is there to say? That's most of it. I would want to address as we get into the social aspect that some people, probably parents, are going to say something like, yeah, but you just need to accept that the child is gonna go away, you know, and you're not gonna have that much time with your child, you know, later after childhood. And seeing your child from time to time is then exciting. You know, it's you should focus on the positives, basically. Um, and I'm not sure that's that real. I wonder just how few people are able to have that perspective. That's to those people. I guess my response is that's a real enlightened perspective. I don't think that's possible for most humans. I don't. That's a very difficult perspective to hold. If you feel that way, really, you're a parent and you really feel that way, that's admirable, I suppose. You must be very fulfilled and capable of expressing that way. But most people are not. Factually, most people are not capable of doing that. So I really don't feel it's a significant distraction from this poem that you theoretically could be positive about these things. Like, sure, but people aren't, though. So I don't think that matters. Anyway, again, though, as we talk about the sort of social thing, I think the crux of the issue for me, I smell a conflict where there's something about the fact that people will not just say that parenting is an unhealthy type of relationship. And so the poem kind of has to not be about that because parenting can't be unhealthy, but the poem is an unhealthy relationship to the people that think that. And so it has to then be about something else. It has to be about, you know, dating or, selfishness, narcissism, codependency, not necessarily in a parent-child relationship. But I don't feel that the poem is at all readable as something other than a parent-child relationship. I think it's just that for a lot of people, they can't abide that this poem depicts a real vision of a parent-child relationship that is a little unhealthy, but it just can't be unhealthy. And so they kind of have to say it's something else. They're having an emotional reaction. They're worried about their child sort of copying the type of relationship in the poem. And it's okay to be concerned about a child's development. Caring about how a child turns out is a caring thing to do in theory. That's all fine, sure. But then because they have that objection, there has to be some material reason. The poem has to be wrong somehow to back up that feeling. You see where I'm going with this? Like, it doesn't actually. They could just be afraid of the poem influencing their child in a way that they're not comfortable with. They could just be afraid of that. But it's very mature to just be afraid of something and admit that you're afraid of it. And most people are not. So they're going to come up with a flaw with the poem, even if the text of the poem doesn't really support that. Again, just a reminder one more time. I promise I'll stop bringing this up, but there's a lot of threads here. You could legitimately critique the poem and ask, are children going to get it? We're going to do that in a minute. I'm just arguing that people who are banning this poem or critiquing it probably aren't actually holding that position. It's probably more that they're simply afraid that their child is going to get the wrong idea, not really because of anything in the text. They're just uncomfortable with that idea. Things influencing their child. It's kind of like It reminds me of bumper stickers a little bit. So there's this statistic about how the more bumper stickers are on someone's car, statistically, it's much more likely they will be a dangerous driver or road rage, etc. And the suggestion is that perhaps this is because they treat their car as a little bit more like their body. There's a lot of studies done on how people often feel as if their car is like their personal space. And so when someone cuts them off in a car, that's not a car in a car, that's two people. I mean, it isn't, but this is how some people feel. And so they take it overwhelmingly personally. And they rage as if someone had shoved them physically. And these people often put bumper stickers on their car, kind of like you would wear clothes that represented something about you. That's seemingly normal to us. And so some people feel that way about their car. They feel like their car is close enough to them that they would. I hope this doesn't sound ridiculous. I don't think it's that ridiculous. I don't get it, but lots of people feel this way. Anyway, we're talking tons of bumper stickers, by the way, right? Like lots of people have their child's college as a bumper sticker. That doesn't, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about people who have, I don't know, maybe as a rule, like more than two bumper stickers. And then the more they have, go figure. You've probably seen people with cars like this. I think it's amazing how often when you see a car, every single time you see a car with lots of bumper stickers, they're driving recklessly or speeding a bit, or I don't know, maybe it's human pattern recognition, but I felt like this was pretty uncanny. When I read that statistic, I thought, oh my goodness, that's so true. Or like people with white cars, that's a topic for another time. Oh my goodness. It's fine if you have a white car. These are just trends. It doesn't mean that's why everybody chose to have bumper stickers or a white car. It doesn't make you evil. It's just something that I believe it's humorously correlative very strongly. It doesn't mean that there's no possible reason you'd get that thing because of that. It's fine. Anyway, not a fan of white cars. Anyway, let's talk about that some other time. But it's related to this in that, again, I think for a lot of people, they just have a general need to limit what their child is exposed to. A person who would want, this poem banned, you might have read this poem and thought, really? This poem? Like you, like Yatogami, would have thought, huh? What? Like, why? It's such an innocuous poem. It's so obviously just about parenting and has a perfectly fine message, you might have thought. Which, fair enough. I actually do think there are some minor concerns with this poem, sure. I'm just pointing out that the kind of person who would want this poem, but really anything, banned, not just their child can't, they don't want them to read it, but the poem has to be banned. They need to decide for everybody else what is right for everyone. Joe Average, knows what is better for everyone's child. Like that sounds like it's not about parenting, because it isn't. And so again, that's why I say there's a real point here that we're going to move on from now about how people concerned about this poem it's not because there's a legitimate problem with the poem in the text that they're pointing to. It's because they have a control problem. It is not because they are worried their child will misunderstand. It's because they are distrustful broadly of human beings. Not because it's unwarranted to be concerned about the poem, but because they are concerned even if there isn't something to be concerned about. It doesn't matter that there is actually a real concern. That's not why they're banning the thing or controlling the thing. You may not specifically agree with, I don't even specifically agree with every reason I've offered for why that might be, but I do strongly feel that the reason that a poem like this would be banned is much more about the people banning it and has very little to do with the poem. So I think it's important to pair those apart. Now, I said earlier that I think an interesting place to go from here is you could critique the poem anyway. I don't think that there's like nothing of concern. We can engage with the topic of, will a child have a reading of this poem that is positive? This requires a knowledge of child psychology that we don't have. I and you statistically don't have. So if any of you do, that's excellent. You'll probably think this part is a bit silly, but I'm going to do the best I can. For what it's worth, I don't know what's best for your child. Do you have a child? Some people might have children. I don't know. I don't know. But this is a lot like people aggressively promoting their religion or telling other people they're bad because of their beliefs being different from their own. I mean, it's obviously silly. You don't know what's good for you, let alone anyone else. I don't know about you all. I don't know what benefits anyone. I'm not even sure what benefits me. That's what I'm working on. Now, do I think I often have ideas that would benefit people? Sure. But to the point that anyone who doesn't come asking, would I then tell them? No. I mean, in Parley, I often do this because I was paid $9 to specifically tell you what I think. Sure. But like, what the hell, people? You don't know anything about what's good for people. It's crazy. Like, and looking at the person's life, it's like when people end up being they're going to be a Supreme Court justice or the president or something, and they get really thoroughly interviewed. It's like that, right? You look at their, they say, oh, you should agree with my views on what your child should read. But then they go home and you look at their house. They haven't like taken out their trash today lately. Their child, isn't given the attention they really should get, etc. So should this person really be the person, you know what I mean? Like if you looked at the person's life for 1 second, everybody would dismiss what they had to say out of hand, but you don't see people's entire social life written right on their face. I actually think you kind of do, but you don't. And so, yeah, people really get pretty far acting like there's something to be scared of with this book. Fear is that good cush, as they say in the business. Okay. I'm going to look at Yatogami's talking points before I do my devil's advocate philosophy thing as well. Yatogami, you said, are non-reciprocal relationships necessarily unhealthy? Setting aside what it means to have a healthy relationship, it's probably easier to identify a relationship that is actively harmful, i.e. unhealthy. And what is your general attitude toward the banning of books and similar materials? Oh, well, I think we already talked about that a good amount. In fact, I would say this first chunk of the parlay was pretty much about that. So I'll move on from that. I hope I did a decent enough job covering that. Again, I think it is a person who understands how humans are influenced would not call for the banning of a text. It is a logic mistake to call for the banning of a text broadly. Maybe you could contrive some situation where I would disagree with that, but broadly speaking, almost every example of something being banned, the first sign is there's enough people who think the thing is not aggressively unban worthy, but just kind of like, again, probably a lot of your reactions to this poem was, what could possibly be dangerous about this? Which, again, I think logically that is perfectly sound. Humans, given enough of a variety of input, are not brainwashed by things that they read. That's weird. Like people don't do that. That doesn't happen. It does happen when people's resources are heavily limited, like when you ban books. So, yeah, I mean, to be no holds barred about it, banning books is idiocy. It doesn't work or make sense logically. The people doing it aren't doing it because the book is problematic. They're doing it because they are problematic and insecure. Those things are okay, but controlling other people's resources because you're insecure is not okay. So anyway, that's very stupid, but I don't think there's much else to say about that. That first question though, Yatogami, that's interesting. I'm going to read it again. Are reciprocal relationships necessarily unhealthy? Setting aside what it means to have a healthy relationship, it's probably easier to identify a relationship that's actively harmful, i.e. unhealthy. Okay, sure, that's definitely a thing to talk about here. So very related to what I floated before, there's a real thing to tackle here. People who are proponents of this poem say, you said they draw comparisons to a parent-child relationship, as if to imply that is a healthy relationship, as if to imply that a parent-child relationship isn't marked by selfishness, narcissism, and codependency. So the poem's either about those things or about a parent-child relationship, but like a parent-child relationship is those things a lot of the time. That's what I think. Let's take a look at that. In other words, a child isn't a scholar of parenthood. A child isn't deeply lost in the sunk cost fallacy of investing in the idea of parenthood as a positive thing. A child can be critical of the idea of parenthood and think that it is tragic, which I think it is, sad or possibly mistaken or unhealthy, which I think maybe it is. A child can feel these things. Would a child feel these things from this poem, and is that bad? Which I think is a surprisingly complicated question. For example, it might be logically sound that parenthood is unhealthy, but if parenthood is inevitable in our current society, now you're asking a question about whether it's good to have a better solution in mind but be unable to enact it, or to just accept the somewhat worse things that way that things are. Is it better for the child to, let's just say for the sake of simplicity, correctly think that parenting is sad and tragic, or to just accept that parenting is what we have and go forward? Which one is better? Who knows? Like, from a philosophical perspective, that's very, I don't know. That's a bigger question than just this poem. So yeah, we'll try. But to give you an example of, I think that's a surprisingly difficult question to answer. Again, I just wanted, I said I wouldn't do this. I'd drive home one more time that I don't think the people banning this book or critiquing it are at all talking about these things. Like, they're not. It's a personal thing for them. Banning books makes no sense. Even if there are these objections, it doesn't make sense to ban a book. Those people don't have these objections, and even if they're there, this isn't a good reason to ban a text. But there could be some objections. So yeah, non-reciprocal relationships being necessarily unhealthy. We're going to tackle the topic for a few minutes of parenthood maybe not being so healthy. I want to start by mentioning again that I think that the poem is about the kind of pure vision of parenthood being simply tragic at some points, not necessarily being good or bad, but just an honest view or a transparent view of parenthood as the writer sees it. It is nice in the beginning. It can be sad as your child goes away to live their life on their own. These are just extremely commonly reported experiences from parents. And then, yeah, like, you'll often spend more time with them in both of your old age. And that could be nice. Maybe the poem, if it has a take on this, is to say that a parenthood marked by just giving, that will feel empty eventually. I'm not sure that's entirely in the text. There's a lot of giving physical objects from the tree. And when the tree stops trying to output physical objects, the tree and the child are more happy. When the tree and the child are, the giving is emotional, the tree is all good. But then when the giving becomes physical, it gets bad. That's a reading. I think that's in the text. At the end of the poem, the giving ends. The tree has nothing left to give, but they're still happy together, according to the poem, suggesting that, again, the thing that's bad is this sort of materialism in the relationship. Which, again, is very related to your question. Are non-reciprocal relationships necessarily unhealthy? The poem seems to say, not if the non-reciprocity isn't material. So in other words, if it's a non-reciprocal relationship, but the lack of reciprocity isn't material, that can be okay, according to the poem. I disagree, by the way. No, it isn't. No, it's not. I don't think non-reciprocal relationships can be healthy if they are relevant. Let me explain why. Very simply, because if somebody on the giving end, the person giving material, emotional output, is going to be healthy mentally, they need to be very fulfilled. They need to be in a very good place in their life where they're getting their needs met. They don't have any insecurity or fear that they can't overcome. They need to be comfortable taking an emotional risk. These are things that essentially nobody can do, has. I know I certainly can't yet fully do those things. A lot of people don't even know is their goal. And unfortunately, for the rest of their life, they will live not knowing that I think their goal should be to be able to be emotionally fulfilled, basically. But they will think that is normal. It's normal not to feel that way. So that's just good then. Kind of like the whole parenting thing, actually. But in theory, you definitely could be a person who didn't really need anything, in short. But I'm talking mostly about emotional things, right? And so you could output things, you could give things. You have I think of it as kind of excess output. You can give people things without it really costing you anything, or you can pay the cost. Again, I'm talking mostly emotionally, but it could be physically too. For a simple example, somebody who has a lot of money, they're very wealthy, but their emotional needs are not met. This is common, of course. A lot of people, there's a whole subreddit for this that is, I shouldn't laugh, it's not really funny, but I think is often, it makes you feel wistful to people that think winning the lottery would solve their problems. No, that would mean you would get to begin solving your problems. And a lot of these people find themselves at a loss because they have a ton of money. They've basically won from our society's perspective, which forces them to realize that our society is wrong, that is a good goal. And they now have no goal. They're just sort of listlessly spending huge amounts of money. When all along, the only thing that really mattered, the only wealth that was really going to be useful, was personal wealth or emotional wealth. The other kind of wealth, you can get it by working hard. It's not difficult logistically, as long as you are in a fair segment of society, which many people unfortunately are not. It's either a foregone conclusion, or our society itself is the problem, and that's a topic for another time. That's very unfair. But it's the emotional development that is what a lot of people think is unnecessary. Our society doesn't tell you you're going to need that, but you will be miserable forever unless you have. So anyway, whatever. Sure, the giver could be in a position to possibly participate in a healthy, non-reciprocal relationship. But what about the receiver? Something the poem doesn't tackle as much. The poem doesn't depict the boy as suffering because they are given things without reciprocating. But you would if you were in the boy's position. Getting things without it being equal will make most people feel inadequate or insecure, meaning that the person on the receiving end also needs to have adequate resources, mental and physical, to feel stable in the relationship, human, romantic, whatever kind of relationship. And if the person on the receiving end has the resources such that they could be in a healthy relationship, then giving that person who has what they need resources that they categorically do not need is a healthy non-reciprocal relationship, but it does nothing. I would argue that at that point, you logically can't give them anything. In other words, to be able to be in a non-reciprocal relationship that is healthy, you need to be unable to benefit from a non-reciprocal relationship that is healthy. So yes, but it doesn't matter. Like, if you are able to, then it is irrelevant. I think. And I don't think that the poem depicts this part. The misfortune that the child befalls by not getting the experience of having a kind of two-way street. Personally, if you don't mind me including this at the end here, I have had a treasured life experience of coming to the point with my parents where we are now trading rather than me simply getting things. I have great parents, by the way, very supportive, economically to some extent, a pretty normal extent, I think. But emotionally too. I was given a lot of freedom as a child. I never really had any doctrine thrust upon me. My parents know this, and my mom sometimes watches these, so this won't upset them. If anything, maybe I had a little too much pressure to succeed academically, but not like a particularly harmful amount. It just wasn't helpful. It's never helpful. But not like a really toxic amount or anything. Like, it's way worse for a lot of people. It wasn't a huge deal, just something that wasn't helpful. But I already had my own issues. It's not a big deal. My parents did a good job, is what I'm trying to say. And I have had the great experience then of being equipped, having no sort of deep-seated hang-up with my parents. They didn't wrong me in any deeply material way. The things that they did that hurt me are things that I now as an adult understand were a misjudgment on their part. They didn't mean it, you know, that kind of thing. And they truly didn't do anything that you could call that bad. They did a great job. And so I've had the great experience of being able to form a real human connection with them, which parenting totally isn't, in my opinion. My mom and I have really gone back and forth on this, so she might have some words, but it's fine. We've talked about this. As philosophical equals, being my age and being my mom's age, having had the time makes you more experienced where you've had the experience, but also more biased. And I'm also an unusually broad person rather than having gone deep in a subject. And I've also gone broad in those subjects very recently each because I'm just relatively younger. So we have unique things to offer. It has been a truly treasured experience to me to be able to have a real exchange of ideas and like recipes, for example, in cooking, or getting to share coffee together. And my mom has a very different coffee setup than me, with an espresso machine and kind of a pour over robot kind of thing, like mid-tier coffee machine, whereas I have a manual setup, but nothing too fancy. I'm not doing a pour over. I'm mostly doing immersion brews, basically what I consider to be better versions of a French press. And we both think that our way is basically the best way. And we have our own, there's various benefits to both ways. And we buy similar, but not quite the same coffee. And we like, you know, that's great. Like, it's such a nice experience because it's a real human connection. I really do feel like parenting, for me anyway, is a unfortunately required lesser version of a good, true human relationship. And if you do a good job as a parent, the best you can do is to end parenting, is to have it be that you can cease being a parent and be a friend, like a human to the other person. Because parenting is, the job description is sacrifice. And I don't really feel like most people are equipped to do that and have it be a truly healthy experience. In the first place, I think a lot of people turn to parenting out of need, out of something to fill an unfulfilled experience in their life. And I know my mom particularly disagrees with that point, but it's not an accusation. I'm just saying I feel like there are some questions philosophically for the goodness of parenthood that people won't ask. That's my problem, really, is like, yeah, I don't know. I haven't been a parent. I don't know. I'm just saying it seems really rough. And so, yeah, I'm sure there's great parents. I had good parents. I'm just saying that looking at it, that would be really remarkable. Like, wow, that's amazing that there are some good parents, which there are. But geez, like, it's a lot of work. Like, that's hard. That just seems, what is the child to take from this? Again, I don't have a lot to say at the end here. Just to make the point that I really don't think the child is going to read, oh, wow, there's this parent figure. The tree is giving the child lots of things, so I'll just do that. Like, the poem is unambiguously negative about that in the middle. I really have trouble believing that a child would miss that point. The question is, at the end of the poem, what does the child think, though? Because it wraps back around to being positive after the tree is given everything they have to give. So I think for some people, there is a sliver of truth of concern that, that almost kind of seems like it's hard to give a lot, but then it's sort of heroic, or like it becomes good at the end. I don't know. I mean, I just feel like the poem that's a lack of faith in children's ability in a child's ability to interpret that it's negative in the middle where the physical giving is happening because the tree is giving parts of themselves. Does a child not understand that? I don't know. I don't have the knowledge of child psychology for that, but I think yes. I don't know. I don't think that's hard to understand. It seems clearly sad that the boy and the tree aren't together, and the poem basically in lockstep has the boy and the tree not together when the tree is giving physical objects to the boy, and then when that ends, they're happy and together. I feel like that's clear. I'm not going to say, again, I think there's a legitimate philosophical concern here, just only a small one, that yeah, I can kind of see how you would read it as it ends up being good, or it's almost heroic at the end, where the tree sacrificed a lot and it was really hard, but then it was good, and so the whole process is good. I really don't think most people would interpret that way, but I don't know. I'm very inexperienced with children, so I really don't know. I just feel like child psychology tells us maybe children aren't so bad at interpreting these things. Children aren't so impressionable. They don't just copy everything that comes in, they interpret things. Children are also uniquely unbiased. That is a strength of youth, is that relative lack of bias at times. Sometimes you can be way over biased. But anyway, again, for a lot of children, they also don't have a sort of sunk cost fallacy where they sort of need to think parenting is positive because they live in a society that kind of requires you to pretend that parenting is all good. Um, so I don't know. I just don't think. I feel like that's okay. I feel like the child will be fine. I feel like you, if you have children, should let your child read this poem. You can just talk to them about it. Another thing I feel very strongly that's really a topic for another time is that this poem and people's fear of the interpretations of this poem is a little bit couched in people's aversion to poetry interpretation in general, when in fact it's often pretty straightforward and people just don't logically go through things step by step, like ever, not in poetry and not ever in their life. People don't do that. They don't have a process for thinking about something. That's not their fault. They weren't taught it. They should have been taught it in school, but they were not. And when we act like, oh, it's so simple to interpret, I want to acknowledge that that's a skill I learned. I believe it is very basic if you begin studying that skill, but a lot of people didn't. I know very well that most people do not think using that process. They don't. They wouldn't come to the conclusions and beliefs that they have if they did. I know they don't. So to say, oh yeah, if you just like think about it logically, you already lost me, right? For most people. So fair enough. Again, I totally get that people would be afraid. That's just no excuse to prevent other people from looking at the thing. It should be adequate for you to just say, I would prefer my child not read that poem, which I believe is wrong, but not in and of itself some huge crime. Deciding for other people based on your completely worthless ideologically opinion that it is harmful because you didn't conclude that opinion using logic, that is wrong. Deciding based on your immature affectation that it's not okay for other people, no, not acceptable. But you're afraid and confused and weren't properly taught to analyze things critically, fine. Like, that's okay. We're not all perfect. You just don't get to decide that for anyone else. This became weirdly somber at the end. I had fun with this one. I hope you enjoyed the way I tackled it. There's a lot of ways you could go about tackling this one. I was more interested in the mechanics behind the things going on here, which I hope is what you wanted. It seems like from the prompts that you gave that you did want that. Are non-reciprocal relationships necessarily unhealthy? It's not a very Giving Tree focused question, so I hope what I did was okay. I think it was. This was fun. It was interesting. You said my low effort parlay for November. I swear to you all, whenever I get a parlay where someone says my low effort blankety blank, it's like one of the better parlays. I don't know. You're not supposed to put in a lot of effort. You can, like, it's cool when you do. But yeah, no, this was interesting. Like, it's fine.